At 2:14 a.m., Sarah Martinez misdials a desperate text. "I'm short $28 for baby formula." On the 78th floor across town, tech billionaire Marcus Wellington reads it and feels a name, a memory, a debt he buried 20 years ago slam back to life. One reply triggers a chain of mercy and truth that will rewrite what they believe about family, fate, and what real wealth can heal. Sometimes destiny uses the wrong number on purpose. The fluorescent lights in Miller's convenience store buzzed, like angry wasps overhead, casting harsh shadows across aisle 3, where Sarah Martinez stood frozen, staring at the price tag on the baby formula container. $47.39. The red numbers seemed to mock her as she counted the crumpled bills in her palm for the third time. $23 in faded 20s and 5s, plus the handful of quarters and dimes she'd scrounged from her car's cup holders and the bottom of her purse. The mathematics of desperation never got easier, no matter how many times she'd performed these calculations over the past 18 months. Rent due in 3 days, utilities already 2 weeks overdue, daycare threatening to drop Emma if she didn't catch up on payments by Friday. The numbers swirled in her mind like a cruel equation that never seemed to balance, no matter how many double shifts she pulled at Mel's diner or how many expenses she cut from their bare-bones budget. Behind her in the shopping cart, 18-month-old Emma gurgled softly, her chubby fingers reaching for the colorful packaging that surrounded them. She was blissfully unaware that her mother was calculating whether they could stretch the last remaining scoops of formula in their apartment for another day, maybe 2 if Sarah watered it down just slightly, a thought that made her stomach clench with guilt and self-loathing. Sarah's phone buzzed against her hip, another automated reminder about an overdue bill. She didn't need to look to know what it was. The collection notices had become as regular as clockwork, each one a reminder of how far behind she'd fallen since Emma's father had disappeared the moment she'd told him about the pregnancy. "Not ready for this kind of responsibility," he'd said, as if 18 months of single parenthood had been a choice she'd made lightly. The store's automatic doors whooshed open behind her, letting in a gust of November air that made Emma shiver in her light jacket. Sarah pulled her daughter's blanket higher, acutely aware that winter was coming, and Emma was already outgrowing her warm clothes. Another expense she couldn't afford, another problem she'd have to solve with creativity and prayer. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over the contacts list. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, not when her daughter's next meal hung in the balance. She scrolled through the limited options. Her sister Maria, who'd already helped twice this month with lectures about making better choices and thinking before acting. Her mother, who lived on Social Security and couldn't spare what she didn't have. Her ex-co-worker Jenny, who'd been laid off last month and was dealing with her own financial crisis. Maria was her best option, even though each request for help came with a side of judgment that stung for days afterward. Sarah composed the text carefully, trying to strike the right balance between desperation and dignity. "Hey, I know I already owe you and I hate to ask again, but Emma's almost out of formula and I'm short on groceries. Can you lend me $50? I'll pay you back Friday when my check comes in. I promise this won't become a habit." She read the message 3 times, each word feeling like a small piece of her pride being chipped away. At 26, she should have her life together. She should be the successful registered nurse she'd planned to become before pregnancy derailed her education. She should be living in her own house with a reliable car and a savings account, not rationing baby formula in a convenience store while calculating whether she had enough gas to make it to work tomorrow. What Sarah didn't notice in her exhaustion and emotional turmoil was the slight tremor in her finger as she scrolled through her contacts. What she thought she'd selected was Maria Martinez, sister. What she'd actually tapped was M. Wellington, a contact that had been accidentally synced from her old temp jobs company directory 6 months ago, a remnant from the 3-day filing assignment at Wellington Tech that she'd completely forgotten about. The send button felt like a point of no return. Once she pressed it, there would be no taking back this moment of vulnerability, no pretending she had everything under control. But Emma chose that moment to babble something that sounded remarkably like "Mama hungry," and Sarah's resolve crystallized. Her daughter's needs trumped her wounded pride now and always. She pressed send. 3 miles away, in the executive penthouse of Wellington Tech Tower, Marcus Wellington was reviewing quarterly projections when his personal phone chimed softly against the mahogany surface of his desk. The sound was unusual. Most people contacted him through official channels, and his personal number was known to fewer than a dozen people. He glanced at the screen, expecting a message from his assistant Jennifer, or perhaps his mother calling from her retirement community in Arizona. Instead, he found a text from an unknown number that made him set down his gold-plated pen and read the words twice. "Hey, I know I already owe you and I hate to ask again, but Emma's almost out of formula and I'm short on groceries. Can you lend me $50? I'll pay you back Friday when my check comes in. I promise this won't become a habit." Marcus had received thousands of requests for money over his 20-year career as a tech entrepreneur. Elaborate business proposals from wannabe inventors, carefully crafted appeals from established charities, desperate pleas from distant relatives who suddenly remembered his existence when their own finances got tight. But this message was different, raw, unfiltered, heartbreakingly real in its simplicity and shame. The mention of baby formula struck something deep in his chest, a place he'd kept. Carefully armored since his daughter Sophie had died in that senseless car accident 8 years ago. He could still picture her gap-toothed smile, the way she'd demand he read just one more story before bed, the sound of her laughter echoing through the empty rooms of his house, the way she'd loved butterscotch pudding and insisted on wearing pink tutus to the grocery store, much to the amusement of other shoppers. His first instinct was to delete the message. Wrong numbers happened, constantly in the digital age, probably some automated scam or misdirected plea that had nothing to do with him. But something about the desperation in those words, the raw honesty of someone swallowing their pride for their child, made him hesitate. He recognized that kind of love, fierce, protective, willing to sacrifice anything and everything for a little person who depended on you completely. Marcus's thumb hovered over the delete button for nearly a minute. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled endlessly. Millions of people living lives he'd never know, facing struggles he'd never comprehend, despite all his wealth and success. Since Sophie's death, he'd felt disconnected from that world, isolated by grief and guilt and the peculiar loneliness that came with having everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. Then, surprising himself, he began to type, "I think you have the wrong number, but I'd be happy to help. With the formula, what store are you at?" He stared at his response for 30 seconds, his business instinct screaming that this could be an elaborate fraud, that he was potentially opening himself up to manipulation or worse. But something deeper, something that sounded suspiciously like Sophie's voice whispering about kindness and second chances, urged him forward. He pressed send. Back in Miller's convenience store, Sarah had moved to the cheaper store brand formula, hoping to make her limited cash stretch a little further. She was reading the ingredient list, comparing it to the name brand version Emma was used to when her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She expected Maria's usual response, a long-suffering sigh, followed by reluctant agreement and a lecture about fiscal responsibility. Instead, she found a text from an unknown number that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "I think you have the wrong number, but I'd be happy to help with the formula. What store are you at?" Sarah read the message 4 times, each reading making her more confused and suspicious. A stranger offering to help. In today's world, that could mean anything from genuine Good Samaritan kindness to elaborate human trafficking schemes. She glanced around the store, suddenly paranoid that someone was watching her, that this was some kind of setup or sick joke. But Emma chose that moment to let out a soft whimper of hunger, and Sarah's protective instincts overrode her natural caution. If there was even a slim chance this person was legitimate, she couldn't afford to walk away. Not when her daughter's next meal was quite literally hanging in the balance. She typed back carefully, trying to sound grateful but not desperate. "I'm at Miller's Mart on Oak Street. Are you absolutely sure about this? I don't want to take advantage of anyone's kindness, and I've never received help from a stranger before." The response came back. Within 3 minutes. Completely sure I'm sending someone over with $200 cash. Should cover formula and whatever else you and Emma need. No strings attached, no repayment necessary. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. $200. That was more than she made in tips during a good week at the diner. It was the difference between choosing groceries or gas money, between keeping the heat on or paying for Emma's prescription vitamins. It was breathing room she hadn't experienced in months. The luxury of walking through a grocery store without calculating every single purchase down to the penny. But it was also terrifying in its generosity. People didn't just give substantial amounts of money to complete strangers, not without wanting something significant in return. She'd learned that lesson the hard way with Emma's father, whose offers of help had always come with conditions that slowly strangled her independence and self-worth. Her hands shaking, she texted back, "Why would you do this for someone you don't know? What do you want in return?" The response took longer this time, and when it came, it hit her like an emotional sledgehammer. "Because someone should have done it for my daughter when she needed it most. Pay it forward someday when you're able, that's all I ask." Past tense. Should have done it for my daughter. The words painted a picture of loss so profound that Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes right there in aisle 3. This stranger had lost a child, the ultimate tragedy for any parent, and somehow her desperate, misdirected text had reached him at exactly the moment when he needed to transform his pain into purpose. 25 minutes later, as Sarah stood nervously by the checkout counter with Emma balanced on her hip, a woman in an impeccably tailored business suit approached them. She was probably in her 40s, with short black hair and the kind of confident bearing that spoke of serious, professional responsibility. "Sarah Martinez?" she asked discreetly, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent Sarah couldn't place. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, instinctively clutching Emma closer. "I'm Jennifer Chen, executive assistant to Mr. Wellington," the woman said, extending a crisp business card. "He asked me to take care of your shopping today." She handed over a thick manila envelope that felt substantial in Sarah's hands. "He also wanted me to give you this personal note." Inside the envelope was $300 in crisp $20 bills and a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "For Emma and whatever else you both need." Sometimes angels come disguised as wrong numbers, and sometimes the universe puts exactly the right message in front of exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Take care of yourself and that beautiful baby. M.W. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she watched Jennifer quietly signal to the cashier, who began ringing up not just the formula Sarah had selected, but a cart full of groceries Jennifer had somehow assembled. Diapers, baby food, fresh fruits and vegetables, milk, bread, pasta, sauce, chicken breast, and even a small toy for Emma. Items Sarah had looked at longingly for months, but never allowed herself to purchase. "I don't understand any of this," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Why is he doing something so generous for a complete stranger?" Jennifer's professional demeanor softened almost imperceptibly as she glanced around to ensure their conversation remained private. "Mr. Wellington doesn't usually explain his charitable decisions to staff members," she said quietly, "but I've worked for him for 8 years, and I can tell you that he lost his young daughter in a car accident some time ago. I believe helping you and Emma allows him to feel connected to her memory in a meaningful way." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't charity from someone who couldn't understand her struggle or sympathy from someone who'd never known real hardship. This was grief transformed into grace. One parent's devastating loss becoming another parent's lifeline. A father who could no longer help his own child, choosing to help someone else's instead. That evening, after Emma had been fed, bathed, and was sleeping peacefully in her crib, her belly full for the first time in days, Sarah sat in her tiny kitchen trying to compose an adequate thank you message. She wrote and deleted dozens of different texts, struggling to find words that could encompass the magnitude of what this stranger had done for them. Not just the money, though that was life-changing in itself, but the reminder that genuine kindness still existed in a world that had felt increasingly cold and unforgiving. The groceries Jennifer had purchased filled their small refrigerator and cabinets completely, more food than Sarah had been able to buy at one time since Emma's birth. She'd actually cried while putting it all away, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of having choices, of not having to calculate every meal down to the last penny. Finally, she settled on, "I don't have adequate words for what you did today. Emma's belly is full, our cabinets are stocked, and my heart is overflowing with gratitude I'll never be able to properly express. Thank you for seeing us when we felt invisible in this world. I promise to pay this forward when I'm able. You've restored my faith in human kindness." Sarah and Emma. Marcus was in his home office at nearly 11 p.m., reviewing contracts by the warm glow of his desk lamp when Sarah's message came through. The house around him was vast and silent, 40 rooms decorated with museum-quality art and furniture that interior designers had selected. Every surface was perfect, every detail carefully curated, but the space lacked the chaotic warmth that only family life could provide. Sophie's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it 8 years ago, pink walls covered with her artwork, stuffed animals arranged on her bed, books scattered across the floor where she'd been reading when he'd called her for dinner that final evening. Sometimes he sat in there for hours, trying to feel close to her, but mostly it just reminded him of everything he'd lost through his own selfish choices. He read Sarah's message 5 times, each reading causing something to shift and settle in his chest. For years after Sophie's death, he'd thrown money at problems as a way of processing his guilt, donating millions to children's charities, funding scholarship programs, writing enormous checks that made board members smile and tax accountants happy. But those gestures had felt hollow, disconnected from any real human impact. This felt entirely different, personal, immediate, real. Without fully understanding his own motivations, Marcus found himself typing back, "How old is Emma?" The response came quickly, as if Sarah had been holding her phone. 18 months next week. She's just learning to walk confidently. Yesterday she took 7 whole steps before sitting down hard on her diaper. I've never been so excited about someone falling down in my entire life. Marcus smiled despite the familiar ache in his chest. Sophie had been 15 when she died, but he remembered those early developmental milestones with crystal clarity. First steps, first words, first attempts at independence that simultaneously thrilled and terrified every parent. Sophie was a late walker too, he found himself typing, surprising himself with the admission. Didn't take her first real steps until 16 months, but once she figured it out, we couldn't keep her still. She'd run everywhere, to the mailbox, around the grocery store, through the house at 6 in the morning. Was? Sarah responded almost immediately, then quickly followed with, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to pry into something painful. Car accident 8 years ago," Marcus replied, the words still difficult to type even after all this time. She was 10 years old, full of energy and dreams and plans for the future. "I can't even begin to imagine that kind of loss. I'm so incredibly sorry for your pain." The conversation continued for over an hour, drifting naturally from shared parenting, experiences to dreams deferred and hopes held close to the heart. Marcus told Sarah about Sophie's passionate love of butterscotch pudding and her absolute insistence on wearing pink tutus to every public outing, regardless of appropriateness. Sarah shared Emma's current fascination with ceiling fans and her uncanny ability to sense her mother's emotional state, becoming fussier when Sarah was stressed and more playful when she was happy. It was nearly 1 a.m. when Marcus finally typed, "Good night," feeling more genuinely connected to another human being than he had experienced in months. For the first time since Sophie's death, he fell asleep without the crushing weight of isolation and purposelessness pressing down on his chest like a physical burden. The friendship that developed over the following weeks surprised them both with its natural ease and emotional depth. Marcus would text during his lunch breaks between meetings, asking about Emma's latest adventures and discoveries. Sarah would send photos throughout her days. Emma's first successful use of a spoon, her intense concentration face while stacking blocks, her gap-toothed grin that reminded Marcus achingly of Sophie, but in a healing rather than painful way. Sarah found herself looking forward to Marcus's messages with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. She'd grown so accustomed to disappointment from the men in her life. Her absent father, Emma's disappearing boyfriend, the casual cruelties of dating while being a single mother, that sustained kindness without obvious conditions felt almost too good to be true. When Emma spiked a dangerous fever at 2 in the morning that sent Sarah racing to the emergency room in a panic, Marcus was the first person she thought to text. When Sarah's ancient Honda broke down in the diner parking lot and she couldn't afford the transmission repair, an envelope appeared at her workplace the next day with enough cash to fix the car and a note reading, "Everyone deserves reliable transportation to support their family. M. I feel like I'm taking advantage of your incredible kindness," Sarah texted one evening after another generous gift had arrived. This time a high-quality stroller that didn't require wrestling matches to fold and unfold, complete with weather protection and storage compartments. "You're not taking advantage of anything," came Marcus's immediate reply. "You're allowing me to be genuinely useful again in ways that matter. Do you have any idea how long it's been since someone actually needed me for something that had real meaning instead of just profit margins?" The confession landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating emotional ripples Sarah was only beginning to understand. This billionaire, with more money than most people could spend across multiple lifetimes, was fundamentally lonely. Adrift in his success and grief, craving the simple human connections that no amount of wealth could purchase or guarantee. Their text conversations grew longer and more intimate as trust developed between them. Marcus shared stories about building Wellington Tech from absolutely nothing. The early days when business failure felt more likely than success, when he'd eaten ramen noodles for months to afford office rent, when potential investors had looked at his youth and inexperience with barely concealed skepticism. Sarah told him about her abandoned dreams of nursing school, how unexpected pregnancy had derailed her carefully planned educational path, but never diminished her determination to eventually help people heal. She described the satisfaction she found in her diner work despite its limitations, the way a smile and genuine attention could transform a customer's entire day, the pride she took in remembering regular orders and personal details. "What's actually stopping you from returning to nursing school?" Marcus asked one evening during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. Sarah stared at the message for several minutes before responding with complete honesty. "Money, obviously. Time, since I'm working 40+ hours just to cover basic expenses. Reliable childcare, which costs almost as much as tuition would. And if I'm being completely truthful, fear that I'm too old now, too far behind academically, too much of a complete mess to ever catch up with." Traditional students. "You're 26 years old. That's not too old for anything except maybe professional gymnastics," Marcus replied, and despite her worries, Sarah laughed out loud in her empty apartment. "Easy perspective to have when you're a billionaire, Mr. Wellington," she texted back. "Actually, I started Wellington Tech when I was 28, feeling ancient compared to all the 22-year-old programming hotshots in Silicon Valley. Age becomes just a number until you decide to let it become a convenient excuse." The words stung because they contained uncomfortable truths Sarah wasn't ready to confront. She'd been using Emma's age, their financial situation, her exhaustion, and her academic gap as protective barriers against the possibility of trying and failing again. But what if they were really just elaborate excuses wrapped in seemingly legitimate concerns? 3 months into their unlikely friendship, Sarah's carefully constructed world shifted again in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was working a particularly hectic lunch rush at Mel's Diner, juggling 6 tables of demanding customers while the kitchen fell behind on orders when her manager, Linda, approached with an unusual request. "There's a gentleman in booth 7 specifically asking for you to be his server," Linda said, curiosity evident in her voice and expression. "Well-dressed guy, expensive suit, looks like serious money. You've been holding out on us. About some sugar daddy situation, Sarah?" Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment and indignation. "It's absolutely nothing like that, Linda. He's just a friend who's helped me out during some tough times." But when she approached booth 7 with her order pad ready, her confident steps slowed to an uncertain shuffle. The man sitting there wasn't just well-dressed. He radiated the kind of quiet, assured power that came with serious wealth and significant responsibility. Salt and pepper hair styled perfectly, a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, hands that had clearly never known manual labor or financial worry. When he looked up from his menu, Sarah felt her entire world tilt on its axis. His eyes were the exact steel grey she'd been imagining during their months of conversations, but seeing them in person created an intimacy and vulnerability she wasn't emotionally prepared to handle. "Sarah." He stood immediately. As she approached, and she was struck by how tall he was, how his mere presence seemed to command the attention of everyone in the restaurant without any apparent effort. "Marcus." Her voice emerged smaller and more uncertain than she'd intended. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" "I was in the neighborhood for a business meeting and thought—" He paused, looking suddenly uncertain for the first time in their entire acquaintance. "I wanted to meet you properly. To see in person the remarkable woman who's been brightening my days for the past 3 months." Sarah became acutely aware of her stained uniform, her hair escaping from its practical ponytail, the persistent smell of grease and coffee that clung to her clothes no matter how much she washed them. This man belonged in corporate boardrooms and exclusive restaurants, not in Mel's diner with its cracked vinyl booths and flickering fluorescent lighting. "I look absolutely terrible right now," she said instinctively, smoothing her apron with nervous hands. "You look like someone who works incredibly hard to take care of the people she loves," Marcus replied softly, his voice carrying surprising warmth. "That's the most beautiful thing in the entire world." The compliment landed like a gentle physical touch, warming places in Sarah's heart that she'd forgotten could feel anything other than worry and exhaustion. She slid into the booth across from him, suddenly nervous in a way their text conversations had never made her feel. "I ordered coffee," Marcus said, gesturing to the cup sitting in front of him. "I hear you have excellent recommendations for everything else." Sarah laughed, despite her anxiety. "Stick to the coffee and maybe the apple pie if you're feeling particularly adventurous. Everything else is, well, let's just say fine dining isn't exactly our primary specialty here." "Perfect, since I'm definitely not here for the food." The weight of his eye, complete attention, was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. Through months of texting, Sarah had built a detailed mental image of Marcus, kind, generous, still grieving, but gradually finding his way back toward joy and purpose. Seeing him in person confirmed all those impressions while adding layers she hadn't expected. The way he listened with his entire body, leaning slightly forward as if her words were the most important things he'd ever heard. The laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of happier times before tragedy had marked him. The careful way he held his coffee cup, like someone long accustomed to handling fragile, precious things. "Tell me about Emma," he said, settling back in the booth. "How is she adjusting to walking? Still taking those adorable tumbles you described?" "She's basically turned into a tiny tornado with legs," Sarah replied, relaxing into the familiar, comfortable territory of discussing her daughter. "Yesterday I found her in my bedroom closet, trying to put on my work shoes. Size 6 heels on 18-month-old feet. It looked like watching a baby giraffe attempt ice skating for the first time." Marcus's laughter was warm and completely genuine. "Sophie used to do exactly the same thing when she was small. She'd clump around our house in my ex-wife's heels, pretending she was going to work like Mommy. The clicking sounds would echo through every room." "Your ex-wife?" Sarah felt something cold and uncomfortable settle in her stomach. Throughout all their conversations over the past months, Marcus had never mentioned being married or having a wife in his life. "Divorced 2 years after Sophie's accident," Marcus clarified quickly, clearly seeing her expression change. Grief affects people in completely different ways. Catherine wanted to forget everything that reminded her of Sophie, pack up all her belongings, sell the house, move somewhere new and pretend none of it had ever happened. I desperately wanted to remember everything, to keep her memory alive and present. Oil and water. Sarah nodded with understanding, recognizing the particular agony of relationships that couldn't survive major crises. "Emma's father disappeared the exact moment I told him about the pregnancy. Said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility or commitment. His loss is absolutely immeasurable," Marcus said with quiet conviction that made Sarah's chest tighten with emotion. "And Emma's incredible gain is having a mother who'd text complete strangers for formula money rather than let her daughter go hungry." The praise made Sarah's eyes well up unexpectedly. For so long, she'd felt like a comprehensive failure. The girl who'd gotten pregnant at 24, dropped out of her nursing program, couldn't maintain a stable relationship, couldn't provide proper financial security for her child. But through Marcus's eyes, she became someone brave, devoted, worthy of admiration and respect. "I should probably get back to work," she said reluctantly, as Linda shot increasingly pointed looks in their direction from behind the counter. "Of course." Marcus stood immediately, leaving a crisp $20 bill on the table for coffee that cost exactly $3. "Sarah, would you be interested in having dinner together sometime? Somewhere with significantly better food and fewer time constraints?" The invitation hung in the air. Between them, like a bridge, Sarah wasn't entirely sure she was ready to cross. Everything about their relationship until this moment had been safe, contained within phone screens and carefully composed text messages. Real dates meant real complications, genuine possibilities for serious disappointment and heartbreak. But looking at Marcus, really studying him, not just the expensive clothing and commanding presence, but the hopeful vulnerability in his steel-grey eyes, Sarah found herself nodding before her logical mind could interfere. "I'd really like that," she said, "but I'll need to arrange proper childcare, and I honestly can't afford—" "I'll handle all the arrangements," Marcus interrupted gently but firmly. "Just tell me when you're available, and I'll take care of everything else." That evening, as Sarah carefully tucked Emma into her crib after their usual bedtime routine, she found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror with new eyes. When was the last time she'd been on an actual date? When was the last time someone had looked at her the way Marcus had today, like she was precious, valuable, worth pursuing despite all her obvious limitations and complications? The thought was simultaneously exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. She'd grown so accustomed to disappointment, to men who promised significantly more than they ever delivered, that allowing hope to flourish felt dangerous to her emotional well-being. But Marcus had already proven himself different through 3 months of consistent kindness, of showing up when he said he would, of asking for nothing except the privilege of being genuinely useful. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text. "Thank you for letting me meet you in person today. You're even more remarkable than I had imagined, which I didn't think was possible. Sweet dreams, Sarah." She stared at the message for several minutes, her thumb hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. Finally, she typed back, "Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me for all of this. I'm scared and excited and completely out of my depth, but I trust you. That's something entirely new for me." "I will never break that trust," came his immediate response. "I promise you that." The date was carefully planned for the following Saturday evening. Marcus arranged for childcare, not just anyone from a generic service, but a licensed, experienced nanny with impeccable references and a gentle manner that immediately put both Sarah and Emma completely at ease. When Sarah protested the obvious expense, Marcus simply said, "Emma's comfort and your peace of mind are absolutely non-negotiable. Everything else is just logistics." Saturday afternoon found Sarah in a state of barely controlled panic, standing in her tiny bedroom completely surrounded by every piece of clothing she owned, spread across her bed and dresser. Nothing seemed remotely appropriate for dinner with a billionaire. Her dresses were either too casual for fine dining or too worn from years of regular use. Her shoes were uniformly sensible rather than stylish, chosen for long shifts on her feet rather than romantic evenings out. She'd never felt the inadequacy of her limited wardrobe so acutely or painfully. Her phone rang, Marcus calling, as if he possessed some supernatural ability to sense her distress. "There's a package waiting outside your front door," he said, without any preamble or greeting. Sarah found an elegant garment bag and matching shoebox on her doorstep, along with a handwritten note. "Just in case you needed some options for tonight, but you could wear a garbage bag and still be the most beautiful woman in any room we enter. M." Inside the bag was a dress that literally made Sarah catch her breath. Midnight blue silk that felt like liquid water flowing between her fingers, clearly expensive but not flashy, elegant without being ostentatious. The shoes were equally perfect, stylish heels that added attractive height without sacrificing comfort for the sake of fashion. Everything fit, as if it had been custom-made specifically for her body. Sarah stared at herself in her small mirror, hardly recognizing the sophisticated woman looking back at her. She looked polished, confident, like someone who naturally belonged in Marcus's rarefied world. But beneath the silk and carefully applied makeup, she remained Sarah Martinez, single mother from the wrong side of town, woman who counted pennies and worried about keeping utilities connected. Could expensive clothes really bridge the vast gap between their different worlds? Or was she just playing elaborate dress-up in a life that could never truly belong to her? Marcus arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, looking devastating in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and distinguished silver hair, but it was the expression on his face. When he saw her, pure admiration mixed with something deeper and hungrier, that took Sarah's breath away completely. "You're absolutely stunning," he said simply, offering his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. The restaurant Marcus had chosen was everything Sarah had expected, and nothing she'd emotionally prepared herself to handle. Intimate lighting that cast everyone in a golden glow, tables spaced widely apart to ensure private conversations, servers who moved like professional, dancers and seemed to anticipate diners' needs before they were even expressed. Sarah felt like an actress playing a role she'd never auditioned for, certain that at any moment someone would recognize her as an obvious imposter. "Relax," Marcus murmured as the maitre d' led them to their reserved table. "You belong here as much as anyone else in this room." But Sarah's discomfort only intensified as the evening progressed at its leisurely pace. The wine list featured bottles that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. The other diners spoke in the careful, modulated tones of people long accustomed to power, influence, and having their smallest preferences immediately accommodated. Even the confident way Marcus navigated the space, utterly at home, completely assured of his welcome, reminded Sarah of the enormous distance between their respective lives and experiences. "You're unusually quiet tonight," Marcus observed as their appetizers arrived on plates that probably cost more than Sarah's rent. Having second thoughts about all of this, Sarah looked across the table at this man who had fundamentally changed her life with his unexpected kindness, who had seen her at her most desperate and vulnerable and responded with grace instead of judgment or superiority. She wanted desperately to be the kind of woman who could sit in this restaurant and feel like she naturally belonged. But honesty had always been the only currency she possessed in abundance. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "This is all so beautiful and perfect and expensive, and I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to suddenly realize that I'm just a waitress with a baby and a mountain of debt, and that whatever this connection is between us doesn't actually make sense in your real life." Marcus carefully set down his fork, his steel-gray eyes never leaving her face. "Sarah, my real life consists of a 40-room house where I eat dinner, alone every single night, surrounded by everything money can purchase and absolutely nothing that actually matters. My real life is endless board meetings and profit margin discussions and people who smile at me exclusively because of what I can potentially do for them, not because of who I am as a human being." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. "You texted a complete stranger asking for help because your daughter needed formula. That single text message was the most real, genuine thing that had happened to me in years. You didn't know who I was, didn't care about my money or business connections or social status. You just desperately needed help. And somehow that reached me at exactly the moment when I needed to feel useful and necessary again." Sarah felt tears threatening, deeply moved by the raw honesty in his voice. "But we come from such completely different worlds, Marcus. I don't know anything about your business, your social responsibilities, the people in your circles. I can't be the kind of sophisticated woman who knows how to navigate charity galas and corporate dinners and whatever other social obligations come with your lifestyle. You're exactly the kind of woman who works double shifts to support her child." Marcus interrupted with quiet firmness. "The kind who says thank you and genuinely means it every single time. The kind who worries about taking advantage of someone's kindness even when you desperately need help. Do you honestly think any of that is somehow less valuable than knowing which fork to use for the salad course?" His words created a spreading warmth in Sarah's chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the expensive wine they'd been sharing. For so long, she'd measured her worth exclusively by external standards: the college degree she hadn't finished, the nursing career she'd had to postpone indefinitely, the man who decided she wasn't worth staying around for when things got complicated. But Marcus saw genuine value in the choices she'd made, dignity and strength in the struggles she'd endured and overcome. "I've never been involved with someone like you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the restaurant's gentle background music. "I don't know the rules or expectations." "There are no predetermined rules," Marcus replied with conviction. "Just two people who genuinely care about each other, trying to figure out how to make that connection work in practical terms. Everything else is just background noise that doesn't matter." The conversation gradually shifted to lighter, more comfortable topics as the evening progressed. Emma's latest accomplishments and adorable mishaps, Marcus's ambitious plans for expanding his company's charitable foundation, shared memories of books they'd treasured as children and movies that had shaped their worldviews. Sarah found herself relaxing, despite the intimidating surroundings, drawn back into the easy intimacy they'd cultivated through months of increasingly personal text conversations. But as their elaborate dessert course arrived, some architectural marvel of chocolate and gold leaf that looked more like art than food, a commotion at the restaurant's entrance disrupted their peaceful private bubble. A woman's voice, sharp with barely contained authority and unmistakable anger, cut through the dining room's cultivated atmosphere like a knife. "I know he's here, Jacques. Don't waste my time pretending you don't know exactly what I'm talking about." Marcus's entire body went rigid, his face draining of color as he immediately recognized the voice. Sarah turned in her chair to see a striking blonde woman in an impeccably tailored designer suit, striding purposefully toward their table, her ice blue eyes blazing with fury and something that looked disturbingly like triumphant satisfaction. "Hello, Marcus," the woman said, her tone dripping with false sweetness as she approached their table uninvited. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your charming little friend here?" Marcus stood slowly, his jaw set with a tension Sarah had never witnessed before. "Victoria, this is absolutely neither the time nor the appropriate place for whatever you think you're doing." "Oh, but I think it's exactly the perfect place," Victoria interrupted smoothly, her calculating gaze raking over Sarah with undisguised contempt and assessment. "I think your little charity project should know exactly what kind of man she's dealing with before this pathetic charade goes any further." Sarah felt ice water forming in her veins as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into horrifying place. This was Marcus's ex-wife, the woman who'd wanted to forget everything about their daughter, while Marcus had desperately wanted to remember and honor Sophie's memory. But there was something else in Victoria's manner, a possessive anger and personal vindictiveness that spoke of much more complicated, unfinished business between them. "You need to leave immediately," Marcus said quietly, but his voice carried an unmistakable warning that Victoria was clearly beyond caring about consequences or social propriety. "Should I tell her about the prenuptial agreement you made me sign, Marcus?" Victoria asked with mock concern, her voice carrying clearly to nearby tables whose occupants were now openly staring at the unfolding drama. "About how you protected every penny of your precious money, even from the woman you claimed to love more than life itself? Or should I tell her about the real reason our marriage ended so badly?" "Victoria, I'm warning you." Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge, but his ex-wife was just getting started with her carefully planned public humiliation. "It wasn't grief that ultimately destroyed our marriage," Victoria announced, addressing Sarah directly with fake sympathy. "It was guilt. You see, my dear naive girl, Marcus was supposed to pick Sophie up from school the afternoon she died in that accident, but he had an extremely important board meeting with potential investors, so he asked me to go instead of taking care of his own daughter. Sophie died because Marcus chose business profits over his child's safety, and he's never been able to forgive himself for that fundamental failure as a father." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each revelation landing with devastating precision and accuracy. She felt all the blood drain from her face as she watched Marcus's carefully maintained composure crumble completely. The confident, successful man she'd come to know, replaced by someone hollow and haunted by unimaginable guilt. "That's more than enough," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's suddenly hushed atmosphere. Is it really enough? Victoria's smile was razor-sharp with malicious satisfaction. Because I think Sarah deserves to know that you've been playing house with her and her baby to assuage your overwhelming guilt about failing Sophie so catastrophically. You couldn't save our daughter, so now you're desperately trying to save hers instead. It's absolutely textbook psychological compensation, really quite predictable. Sarah's chair scraped harshly against the marble floor as she stood abruptly, her hands shaking, uncontrollably as she reached for her purse. The beautiful silk dress that had made her feel like Cinderella preparing for the ball suddenly felt like an elaborate costume, and the entire fairy tale evening was crashing down around her with brutal, inescapable finality. Sarah, please wait. Marcus reached desperately for her arm, but she stepped back as if his touch would burn her skin. Is it true? She asked, her voice barely rising above a whisper. About Sophie? About the meeting? Marcus's silence was answer enough, more damning than any words could have been. Sarah could see the crushing guilt written across his features like a roadmap of pain, the weight of an unbearable burden he'd been carrying alone for 8 long years. Everything Victoria had said suddenly made horrible perfect sense. The immediate response to her desperate text, the overwhelmingly generous gifts, the way he'd entered their lives like some kind of guardian angel. Not because he genuinely cared about Sarah and Emma as unique individuals, but because helping them helped him feel less responsible for his own daughter's preventable death. Sarah, please let me explain what really happened. But Sarah was already walking rapidly toward the restaurant's exit, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor like a countdown to complete disaster. She heard Marcus call her name again, heard some kind of commotion as he presumably dealt with Victoria's continued presence, but she didn't stop moving. Couldn't stop. The weight of humiliation and betrayal was too crushing to bear witness to for another second. Outside the restaurant, Sarah fumbled frantically for her phone to call a taxi, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. The November air cut through the silk dress like ice, raising goosebumps along her arms and making her acutely aware of how far from home she was in every possible sense. Geographically, socially, emotionally. A sleek black car pulled smoothly up to the curb. Marcus's driver, she realized, with another wave of humiliation, sent to ensure she got home safely. Even in her desperate escape, she remained completely dependent on his resources, his money, his guilt-driven generosity. The bitter irony was almost too much to swallow. The ride back to her apartment passed in a blur of city lights and barely contained tears. Sarah stared out the tinted window, mechanically replaying every single interaction she'd had with Marcus through the new devastating lens Victoria had provided. Had any of it been genuine? The late-night texts about Emma's milestones, the photos she'd shared, the growing emotional intimacy she'd thought was building between them. Had it all just been elaborate grief therapy for a billionaire trying to buy his way out of overwhelming guilt? By the time she reached her modest apartment building, Sarah's initial shock had crystallized into a cold, protective anger. She paid the babysitter with money Marcus had provided, yet another reminder of her pathetic dependence, and then sat in Emma's darkened nursery, watching her daughter sleep peacefully while her entire world reconstructed itself around this new, horrible understanding of reality. Her phone buzzed insistently with incoming text messages from Marcus. Please give me a chance to explain what happened tonight. Victoria was deliberately trying to hurt both of us. Don't let her succeed in destroying something real. You and Emma aren't charity cases or projects. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. Sarah, please, just give me one opportunity to tell you the complete truth. Each message felt like salt being poured into an open wound. Sarah finally turned off her phone completely and went to bed, but sleep proved utterly impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victoria's triumphant smile, heard the echo of her cutting words about psychological compensation and guilt-driven charity work. The next morning brought an insistent knock at Sarah's front door. She opened it reluctantly to find Jennifer Chen, Marcus's executive assistant, holding a thick manila envelope and wearing an expression of professional sympathy. Mr. Wellington asked me to deliver this personally, Jennifer said, her usual crisp demeanor softened by something that looked remarkably like genuine concern. He also wanted me to tell you that while he's not giving up on your relationship, he'll completely respect your need for space and time to process everything. Inside the envelope was a letter written in Marcus's careful, precise handwriting across several pages of expensive stationery. My dearest Sarah, everything Victoria said about the circumstances of Sophie's accident is completely and utterly true. I was supposed to pick her up from school that day, and I made the conscious decision to prioritize a board meeting with potential investors instead. I've lived with the consequences of that choice every single day for 8 years, and I will probably carry that guilt for the rest of my natural life. But what Victoria said about you being psychological compensation, that is fundamentally, completely untrue. Yes, helping you and Emma initially felt like a meaningful way to honor Sophie's memory and channel my grief into something constructive. But what grew and developed between us over these months had absolutely nothing to do with guilt, and everything to do with who you are as a remarkable human being. You're not a charity case or a project or a convenient way for me to feel better about my failures as a father. You're a woman who impressed me with her incredible strength, her natural humor, her fierce devotion to her child. You're someone who made me laugh again after years of barely remembering how, who reminded me that life could still hold genuine surprises and unexpected joy. I should have told you about the specific circumstances of Sophie's death from the very beginning. I should have been completely honest about my initial motivations for responding to your text. I was afraid, terrified actually, that you'd see me the way I see myself, as someone whose professional success couldn't protect what mattered most in the world. Victoria wanted to hurt both of us tonight, and she succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. But please don't let her deliberate cruelty destroy something genuine and valuable. What I feel for you has nothing to do with Sophie or guilt or trying to somehow rewrite the unchangeable past. It's about hope for a real future, something I had completely given up on until you accidentally texted me asking for help. I love you, Sarah, not as a symbol or a project or a way to ease my conscience, but as the remarkable woman who has been lighting up my life for the past 4 months. I love Emma not because she reminds me of Sophie, but because she's yours, and watching you love her has reminded me what pure, selfless devotion actually looks like. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me for not being completely honest from the very start, I promise to spend every day for the rest of my life proving that what we have together is real, meaningful, and worth fighting for. If you can't forgive me, I'll understand and respect that decision, but I will never regret a single moment we've shared or a single way you've changed my life for the better. You saved me in ways you may never fully understand, Sarah. Please let me spend the rest of my life returning that favor. All my love, always, Marcus. Sarah read the letter 5 times, her emotions churning violently between justified anger and desperate longing, deep hurt and fragile hope. The rational part of her mind methodically catalogued all the perfectly valid reasons to walk away permanently, the vast differences in their circumstances and backgrounds, the complicated dynamics of grief and guilt, the profound humiliation of discovering that their relationship had begun as Marcus's attempt to process his own psychological trauma. But the letter felt true in a way Victoria's cruel revelations somehow hadn't. Sarah remembered the genuine warmth in Marcus's eyes when he'd looked at her in the restaurant, the completely spontaneous laughter when she'd told him about Emma's daily adventures, the careful attention he'd always paid to her dreams and fears and hopes for the future. Those moments had felt authentic because they were authentic. For 3 agonizing days, Sarah avoided Marcus's calls and text messages, wrestling internally with her decision while mechanically going through the motions of normal life. She returned to work at the diner, automatically serving coffee and taking orders, while her mind obsessively replayed every interaction she'd ever had with him, searching for signs of deception or manipulation she might have missed. Linda noticed her obvious distraction and uncharacteristic silence, but had the wisdom not to comment directly, instead simply ensuring Sarah's tables were manageable and her breaks came regularly. On Thursday evening, as Sarah was giving Emma her nightly bath, her daughter suddenly pointed at the silent phone sitting on the bathroom counter, and said something that sounded remarkably like Marcus. It was only Emma's fifth or sixth clearly recognizable word, but she had somehow connected the device that had brought so much joy and positive energy to their lives with the man who had been brightening their days consistently for months. Sarah stared at her daughter in amazement, suddenly struck by a realization that cut through all her emotional turmoil. In all the adult drama and psychological analysis of the past few days, she'd completely forgotten the most important perspective of all. Emma didn't care about guilt or psychological compensation or the complex dynamics between adults processing trauma. She only knew that someone had helped them when they needed it most, and that her mother had been noticeably happier and more relaxed during recent months than ever before in her short life. That night, after Emma was safely asleep, Sarah finally turned on her phone and scrolled through the dozens of messages Marcus had sent. They weren't pushy or demanding or manipulative, just gentle reminders that he was thinking of her, that he missed their daily conversations, that he hoped she and Emma were doing well. The final message, sent just 2 hours earlier, was the simplest and most devastating. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. Whenever you're ready to talk, I'll be here waiting." The simple promise broke something loose in Sarah's chest that she'd been holding tightly closed. She'd spent most of her life dealing with people who left the moment things became complicated. Her parents when she'd gotten pregnant, Emma's father when reality set in, friends who drifted away when single motherhood consumed her social availability and energy. But here was someone offering to stay, to wait patiently, to be present through the mess and uncertainty and emotional complexity. Sarah found herself typing before her logical mind could interfere and second-guess the decision. "Can we meet tomorrow? Just to talk honestly about everything." The response came within 30 seconds. "Anywhere you want, anytime you say." The park by Miller's Mart where this all started. 2 p.m. I'll bring Emma. I'll be there. Thank you for giving us this chance. Friday afternoon found Sarah pushing Emma's stroller through Riverside Park, her stomach twisted into knots with nervous anticipation and emotional uncertainty. She'd chosen this location very deliberately, public enough to feel safe and untrapped, familiar enough to feel comfortable and controlled, and meaningfully associated with the grocery store, where their entire story had begun with a desperate text and an unexpected response. Marcus was already waiting on a wooden bench near the children's playground, looking unusually vulnerable and uncertain in casual jeans and a simple sweater instead of his typical business attire. When he saw them approaching along the tree-lined path, he stood carefully with the cautious movements of someone afraid of startling a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden motion. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, as Sarah settled beside him on the bench, positioning Emma's stroller where they could both easily see her. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity to explain everything." "I needed to hear it directly from you," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she actually felt inside. "All of it. The complete truth about Sophie, about why you really responded. To my text, about what all of this has actually meant to you." Marcus was silent for several long moments, watching Emma babble contentedly as she played with a soft stuffed animal, her chubby fingers exploring its different textures with intense concentration. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion and barely controlled grief. Sophie was in 5th grade when she died. 10 years old, all sharp elbows and knobby knees, and absolutely boundless energy. That particular day, the day she died, she had called me during my lunch break to ask if I could possibly pick her up early from school because she'd finished her science project and was excited to show it to me before her presentation the next morning. He paused, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. I told her I couldn't leave work early, that she should take the school bus home like she always did, and we'd look at her project together after dinner. She said, "Okay." Daddy in that particular disappointed voice children use when they're trying hard not to show how hurt they feel. Sarah felt her throat tighten painfully as she imagined that conversation, the weight Marcus must carry from those seemingly casual words that became so much more significant and devastating in hindsight. Victoria picked her up instead, like she did every Tuesday when her schedule permitted. They were exactly 3 blocks from our house when a drunk driver ran a red. light and hit them head-on at full speed. Victoria survived with relatively minor injuries, a broken wrist, some bruising, temporary amnesia. Sophie, his voice broke completely, the successful billionaire reduced to a grieving father who would never stop mourning his child. Sophie was gone before the paramedics could even arrive at the scene. The stark, brutal pain in his words made Sarah's chest ache with empathy. She could see 10-year-old Sophie clearly in her imagination, eager to share her accomplishment, disappointed by her father's work priorities, never knowing those would be their final words to each other. Victoria blamed me completely, and she was absolutely right to do so, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength through the confession. If I had left work early, like Sophie asked, like a good father should have, she would have been with me, instead of in that car with Victoria. If I had prioritized my daughter over a quarterly review, meeting with investors, she would still be alive today. That's not speculation or self-pity, that's simple, inescapable fact. You couldn't have known what would happen, Sarah said softly, instinctively offering comfort despite her own emotional turmoil. You might have been in a different accident, or I've mentally played out every possible alternative scenario literally millions of times over the past 8 years, Marcus interrupted with bitter certainty. But the fundamental fact remains unchanged. I chose work obligations over my daughter's happiness, and she died because of that choice. Victoria couldn't stand to be around me after that, couldn't tolerate the constant reminders of what we'd lost and how it could have been prevented. Sarah began to understand the deeper fractures that had destroyed Marcus's marriage, the impossible divide between two completely different ways of processing overwhelming grief and assigning responsibility. Victoria wanted to pack up Sophie's bedroom immediately, donate all her clothes and toys, sell our house and move somewhere new where we could pretend none of it had ever happened, Marcus explained. I couldn't let Sophie disappear from our lives like that. I needed to remember her, to keep her memory alive and present somehow. Victoria called it unhealthy obsession and psychological self-torture. Maybe she was right about that too. Emma chose that precise moment to drop her toy, pointing directly at Marcus and making her version of his name with delighted recognition. Without any hesitation, Marcus retrieved the stuffed animal and handed it back to her, earning one of her brilliant gummy smiles that could melt the hardest heart. When I received your text that night 4 months ago, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident, something about it immediately reminded me of Sophie. Not the specific words themselves, but the fierce, protective love behind them. The absolute devotion of a parent willing to do literally anything for their child's welfare. I had failed completely to protect Sophie, but maybe, just maybe, I could help protect Emma instead. Sarah felt the painful truth of Victoria's accusations settling in her chest like heavy stones. It had started as grief therapy and guilt management, exactly as his ex-wife had so brutally claimed. But Sarah... Marcus turned to face her completely, his steel-gray eyes intense. With desperate sincerity, what started as guilt and grief became something entirely different. Getting to know you as a person, watching you love Emma with such devotion, hearing about your dreams and fears and hopes for the future. That had absolutely nothing to do with Sophie, and everything to do with you as a unique, remarkable individual. He gestured toward Emma, who was now attempting to share her toy with a curious squirrel that had ventured close to their bench. I don't love Emma because she reminds me of my daughter, or because caring for her makes me feel less guilty about failing Sophie. I love her because she's yours, because she's this perfect, joyful little person you've created and nurtured, despite impossible circumstances. And I don't love you because helping you assuages my guilt about Sophie's death. I love you because you're brave and funny and kind, because you text strangers for help when your child needs something, and then worry, constantly about taking advantage of their kindness. The words hung in the crisp autumn air between them, honest and raw and terrifying in their complete vulnerability. Sarah felt her carefully constructed emotional walls beginning to crumble, but years of disappointment and self-protection held her back from complete surrender to hope. How can I possibly know the difference? She asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the park's background sounds of children playing and leaves rustling in the breeze. How can I tell when the guilt ends and the genuine feelings begin? Marcus was quiet for a long time, considering her question with the serious attention it deserved. I suppose you can't know with absolute certainty, he finally admitted with painful honesty. I can't definitively prove to you that my feelings are completely separate from my grief, any more than you could prove that yours aren't influenced by gratitude or the financial security I can provide. But I can tell you that when I imagine my future now, it doesn't look like penance or therapy or guilt management. He paused, his expression growing soft with hope and longing. It looks like Sunday mornings with you and Emma, teaching her to ride a bicycle in this same park, helping you study when you return to nursing school, growing old together and arguing about what to watch on Netflix while Emma brings her own children to visit their grandparents. Sarah felt unexpected tears threatening at the simple domestic picture he painted with such vivid detail. For so long, her future had looked like nothing more than survival, getting through each day, making ends meet financially, hoping nothing catastrophic happened to destroy the fragile stability she'd managed to create. The idea of a future genuinely filled with ordinary happiness and shared dreams felt almost too precious to dare contemplate. Victoria was right about one fundamental thing, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. We really are from completely different worlds, Marcus. I still don't know how to navigate yours successfully. I don't know how to be the kind of sophisticated woman who belongs naturally in expensive restaurants and charity galas and whatever other social obligations come with your lifestyle and social position. You don't need to become someone entirely different, Marcus replied, with firm conviction that surprised Sarah with its intensity. My world desperately needs more people like you, people who understand what genuine struggle means, who remember what kindness feels like when you're truly desperate and vulnerable. You could teach them things that money simply cannot buy or provide. The conviction in his voice stirred something hopeful and powerful in Sarah's chest. Maybe she didn't need to completely transform herself to fit into his life. Maybe she could bring her own unique value, her own hard-earned perspective, her own strength and authenticity to whatever they might build together. Emma's increasingly fussy sounds interrupted their intense conversation, signaling her growing need for a diaper change and afternoon snack. As Sarah efficiently tended to her daughter's needs with the practiced ease of experienced motherhood, Marcus watched with the careful, absorbed attention she'd come to recognize. Not the detached observation of someone playing a role or fulfilling an obligation, but the genuine interest and affection of someone who truly cared about the details of their daily lives. There's something else I need to tell you, Marcus said when Emma was comfortable and settled again, contentedly munching on crackers from her diaper bag. Something I should have mentioned weeks ago, but I was afraid of overstepping boundaries or making you feel pressured. Sarah's stomach dropped with anxiety, wondering what other significant revelations might be coming. What is it? I've been quietly researching nursing programs in the area that might work for your situation, not to make decisions for you or pressure you in any direction, but just to understand what it would actually take to make your dream a realistic possibility. There's an excellent program at University Hospital that offers flexible scheduling, specifically designed for working parents, and they have a very generous scholarship program for students with demonstrated financial need. Sarah stared at him, torn between gratitude for his thoughtfulness and frustration at his presumption in investigating her personal goals without permission. Marcus, I know I overstepped, he said quickly, clearly reading her expression. But Sarah, you absolutely light up when you talk about helping people heal and recover. You have this natural instinct for care and compassion that simply cannot be taught in any classroom. It would be a genuine crime for the world to lose that gift because of logistics and financial constraints. The fact that he had remembered her abandoned dreams with such specificity, had invested time and energy in researching practical solutions, touched something profound in Sarah's heart. No one had ever believed in her potential strongly enough to investigate how to make it an actual reality. The application deadline for next year's program is in 6 weeks, Marcus continued carefully, clearly trying not to sound pushy or controlling. I could help with all the associated costs, tuition, childcare, living expenses while you're in school, whatever you need. Not as charity or some kind of guilt-driven project, but as an investment in someone I believe in completely. That's an enormous financial commitment, Sarah protested, her practical mind immediately calculating the staggering costs involved. Nursing school is 4 years of full-time study, and there's absolutely no guarantee I'd even be accepted, or that I'd succeed if I was admitted. I make more money in investment interest every single month than most people see in several lifetimes, Marcus replied with matter-of-fact honesty. Money genuinely isn't the limiting factor here. The only question that matters is whether you want to try pursuing this dream. Sarah felt the familiar internal war between hope and fear raging violently in her chest. For 2 years, she'd told herself that nursing school was impossible, that single mothers like her didn't get second chances at dreams deferred by circumstances. But what if that had been fear masquerading as practical realism? I'm terrified, she admitted with raw honesty. Scared of failing academically, scared of becoming even more dependent on you financially, scared of what happens if this relationship between us doesn't work out, and I'm in the middle of an expensive program you're funding. I'm scared too, Marcus said softly, his vulnerability matching hers completely. Scared of somehow messing this up, scared of letting you down the way I let Sophie down, scared that I'll never truly be worthy of the second chance you're considering giving me. The mutual vulnerability in his confession broke through Sarah's remaining emotional defenses. They were both damaged people trying to figure out how to love again without guarantees or safety nets. Maybe shared courage and honesty were enough to build something meaningful on. Emma chose that perfect moment to reach her arms out toward Marcus with the unconscious trust that only children possess. Marcus lifted her carefully, his entire face transforming with wonder and tenderness as she settled comfortably against his chest with a contented sigh that spoke of complete security and acceptance. She really likes you, Sarah observed, watching the gentle way Marcus supported Emma's small body, the instinctive rocking motion he'd probably learned as Sophie's devoted father years earlier. She's absolutely perfect, Marcus murmured, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to the top of Emma's downy head. Completely and utterly perfect. Watching them together, this powerful, successful man reduced to wonder by an 18-month-old's unconditional trust, her daughter completely at ease in arms that had once held and comforted another little girl. Sarah felt the last of her protective resistance finally crumble completely. "Okay," she said quietly, the single word carrying the weight of a life-changing decision. Marcus looked up from Emma's sleepy form, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Okay? Okay, let's try this, all of it. The relationship, nursing school, figuring out how to blend our very different lives successfully. But I need complete honesty from you, Marcus. Total transparency, even when it's uncomfortable or complicated or potentially hurtful." The smile that spread slowly across Marcus's face was like sunrise after the longest, darkest night of the year. "Honest, I can definitely do. Starting right now, I'm absolutely terrified that I'm going to mess this up somehow, but I have never wanted anything to work out more in my entire life." Sarah laughed, feeling giddy with the profound relief of a difficult decision finally made. "Honestly, I'm terrified too, but I think you're worth the risk. I think we're worth the risk." The next several months unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of two people, learning to trust each other with their deepest vulnerabilities and most closely guarded dreams. Marcus kept his solemn promise of complete honesty, sharing his ongoing fears about being an adequate partner and potential stepfather, his daily struggles with guilt and grief, his amazement at finding genuine love again when he'd been convinced that part of his life was permanently over. Sarah applied to the nursing program with Marcus's enthusiastic encouragement and financial support, throwing herself into application essays and entrance exam preparation with a determination and focus that surprised even her. When the acceptance letter finally arrived on a snowy February morning, she cried for 20 minutes straight, not just from relief but from the profound realization that dreams deferred didn't necessarily mean dreams denied forever. Their relationship deepened gradually but steadily, built on the solid foundation of friendship and mutual respect they'd established through months of honest text conversations. Marcus spent most evenings in Sarah's tiny but cozy apartment, reading bedtime stories to Emma while Sarah studied at her small kitchen table, helping with bath time and nighttime routines, with the careful attention of someone genuinely grateful for the privilege of domestic intimacy and shared responsibility. Sarah slowly began meeting people from Marcus's professional and social world, discovering to her surprise that many of them were more interested in her unique perspective and life experiences than intimidated by her modest background. At charity events and business dinners, she found herself engaged in meaningful conversations about healthcare accessibility, single-parent support systems, and social justice issues, her hard-earned experience lending authenticity and depth to discussions that had previously been purely theoretical for most participants. The integration wasn't always smooth or effortless. There were inevitable moments when the significant differences in their backgrounds created tension and misunderstanding. When Marcus instinctively tried to solve problems by throwing money at them, while Sarah wanted to work through challenges independently. When Sarah felt overwhelmed by the expectations and scrutiny that came with dating such a prominent public figure. When they both struggled to find the right balance between Marcus's genuine desire to provide and Sarah's hard-won need for independence and self-sufficiency. But they worked through each conflict with the kind of patient, honest communication they'd promised each other from the beginning. Marcus gradually learned to ask before assuming Sarah wanted financial solutions to her problems. Sarah slowly learned to accept help and support without feeling diminished or controlled by it. They both discovered that real love wasn't about becoming identical people, but about respecting and celebrating each other's differences while building something entirely new together. 6 months after their disastrous first dinner date, Marcus planned a very different kind of evening. He arranged for the same trusted babysitter to watch Emma, but instead of an intimidating fancy restaurant, he brought Sarah to the rooftop garden of his downtown office building. The normally corporate space had been magically transformed with thousands of fairy lights and glowing candles, a small intimate table set with simple, delicious food and unpretentious wine. "This is so much better," Sarah said with genuine appreciation, settling into her chair with a relaxed smile. "Though I do have to ask, did you buy out the entire building to ensure our privacy? Or is this just a normal Tuesday evening for you?" "I may have asked the other tenants to stay inside for a few hours," Marcus admitted with a self-deprecating grin. "But in my defense, I had something extremely important to discuss with you, and I didn't want any possible interruptions or distractions." Sarah raised an eyebrow with playful suspicion. "Should I be worried about what's coming?" Instead of answering directly, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet jewelry box. Sarah's breath caught audibly as he opened it to reveal a ring that was absolutely stunning in its understated elegance. A single perfect diamond in a classics platinum setting, timeless and beautiful rather than ostentatious or showy. "Sarah Martinez," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion in his steel-gray eyes. "7 months ago, you accidentally texted me asking for baby formula money. That single desperate message saved my life in ways you may never fully understand or appreciate." He left his chair and knelt beside hers on the rooftop, taking her trembling hand gently in both of his. "You've taught me that love isn't about perfection or having all the right answers to life's challenges. It's about showing up consistently, being completely honest even when it's difficult, and choosing each other every single day, even when circumstances get complicated. You've shown me that second chances are real and possible, that guilt doesn't have to be a permanent life sentence, that joy and sorrow can coexist in the same heart." Sarah felt tears streaming freely down her face as Marcus continued with growing confidence. "I want to spend the rest of my life earning and re-earning the trust you've given me. I want to watch Emma grow up, to celebrate her first day of school and her high school graduation and her wedding day when she's ready. I want to support all your dreams and ambitions, to be your partner in every adventure still ahead of us." He lifted the ring with hands that were surprisingly steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. "Will you marry me, Sarah? Will you let me love you and Emma for the rest of our lives? Will you build a family with me?" Through her tears of overwhelming joy and disbelief, Sarah could barely whisper the word that would change everything. Yes, the ring fit absolutely perfectly, of course. Marcus had paid meticulous attention to every detail throughout their relationship, just as he'd been doing since that very first desperate text message months ago. As he slipped the platinum band onto her finger, Sarah felt the weight of it not as a burden or obligation, but as a tangible promise. A promise of true partnership, of shared dreams finally within reach, of love that had been tested by complete honesty and emerged stronger than ever. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," Marcus said as they settled back in their chairs, Sarah still staring at her ring in amazement, watching it catch and reflect the fairy light surrounding them. "I've been working closely with my legal team and financial advisors to establish something called the Sophie and Emma Foundation. It will provide emergency assistance to single parents across the country, help with childcare costs, medical bills, educational expenses, whatever struggling families need to maintain stability and hope." Sarah looked up from her ring, her heart swelling with profound love for this man who had transformed his deepest grief into meaningful purpose. "Marcus, that's incredible. I want Emma to grow up knowing that her story, our story, became the beginning of something that helped thousands of other families," Marcus explained, his voice thick with emotion. "I want Sophie's memory to be forever connected to hope and healing, instead of just loss and regret. Every family we help will carry forward both their legacies." The foundation, Sarah realized with crystal clarity, was Marcus's way of transforming the guilt he'd carried for 8 years into something constructive and healing, not erasing his responsibility for Sophie's death. That burden would always be part of him, but channeling his regret into meaningful action that honored both his daughter's memory and the love he'd found with Sarah and Emma. "I love you so much," Sarah said simply, the 3 words carrying all the weight of everything they'd overcome together, everything they'd learned about themselves and each other. "I love your generous heart, your determination to turn pain into purpose, your commitment to making something beautiful out of something broken." "I love you too," Marcus replied, reaching across the small table to take her hand. "Both of you, my girls, my family." As if summoned by their emotional declaration, Sarah's phone buzzed insistently with a call from the babysitter. Emma had awakened from her evening nap, asking specifically for Marcus, and absolutely refused to settle back down without seeing him first. They drove back to Sarah's apartment together, where Marcus immediately scooped up a tear-streaked Emma and rocked her back to peaceful sleep, while singing a gentle lullaby Sarah had never heard him sing before. Later that night, Sarah learned it was the same song he had sung to Sophie during her bedtime routine, a precious piece of his previous life that he was finally ready to share with his new family, connecting past love with present hope. The wedding took place exactly 10 months later in the same park where they'd had their crucial conversation about truth and trust and second chances. It was deliberately small and intimate. Sarah's sister Maria, a handful of close friends, Marcus's mother who had flown in from Phoenix and immediately fallen head over heels in love with both Sarah and Emma. Instead of a traditional ceremony with standard vows, they wrote completely personal promises to each other, committing to honesty, equal partnership, and love that could survive and grow stronger through both triumph and inevitable tragedy. Emma, now walking confidently and chattering in complete sentences, served as their flower girl, toddling down the makeshift aisle in a pink dress that would have made Sophie smile with delight. Marcus's vows included solemn promises to Emma as well, to love her as his own daughter completely, to support all her dreams without reservation, to be the father who showed up for every important moment of her life. Sarah's nursing school graduation fell on a perfect, sunny day in May, exactly 2 years after their wedding ceremony. Marcus and 3-year-old Emma sat proudly in the front row of the auditorium, Emma bouncing with barely contained excitement as she spotted Mama in the sea of caps and gowns. When Sarah's name was called, and she walked confidently across the stage to receive her Bachelor of Science in Nursing degree, Marcus stood up and cheered with the unself-conscious joy of someone who had learned that celebrating others' victories was one of life's greatest privileges and pleasures. The Sophie and Emma Foundation had grown far beyond Marcus's initial vision, now serving over 2,000 families across 15 states. Sarah served on the board of directors, her lived experience as a former single mother, bringing crucial perspective and authenticity to their programs and policies. They had established partnerships with nursing schools nationwide to provide full scholarships for parents pursuing healthcare, careers, contracted with daycare centers that offered sliding scale tuition based on family income, and created emergency funds that could bridge the gap between crisis and stability for families in desperate need. On quiet evenings, when Emma was safely asleep, and they sat together in the beautiful home they'd built, not Marcus's intimidating mansion where he'd rattled around alone, but a warm, comfortable place filled with laughter and love and the beautiful chaos of family life. Sarah sometimes marveled at the incredible journey that had brought them together against all odds. A single desperate text sent to the wrong number had somehow become the foundation for a love story that now touched hundreds of lives across the country. Marcus's crushing guilt had been transformed into meaningful purpose, Sarah's struggles had become sources of strength and wisdom, and Emma had gained a devoted father who treasured every ordinary moment of her childhood and promised to be there for every milestone still to come. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had sent that text to the right number that night?" Sarah asked one evening as they watched Emma play in their backyard, chasing fireflies with a butterfly net Marcus had bought her. Marcus considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness, watching their daughter's pure joy in the simple pleasure of a summer evening. "I think I would have continued existing instead of truly living," he said finally, his voice soft with gratitude. "Going through all the motions of success, professionally accomplished but emotionally hollow. Carrying guilt that was slowly poisoning everything good in my life." He turned to look at Sarah, his steel-gray eyes warm with deep contentment and unshakable love. "And I think you would have found another way to survive and eventually thrive, because that's exactly who you are at your core. But maybe it would have taken much longer for you to believe you deserved more than just basic survival." Sarah nodded, understanding the profound truth in his words. They had both been existing in different forms of emotional purgatory before that accidental connection. Marcus drowning in isolation and self-imposed guilt, Sarah barely treading water in poverty and constant worry. Neither of them had been actively looking for love or partnership, but somehow destiny had found them anyway, through the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. Emma ran over to them, grass stains decorating her sundress and wilted dandelions clutched triumphantly in her small fists. "Daddy, look what I found for you," she announced breathlessly, presenting Marcus with her treasure as if it were made of gold and precious gems. "It's absolutely beautiful, sweetheart," Marcus said with complete seriousness, accepting the gift with the reverence that Emma's offerings always deserved. "Should we put it in water so it stays pretty longer?" As Emma nodded enthusiastically and skipped toward the house, Sarah caught Marcus's hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "For what? For seeing us when we felt invisible, for staying when others would have left, for proving that sometimes the wrong number is exactly the right number at exactly the right moment." Marcus brought her hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her palm. "Thank you for being brave enough to ask a complete stranger for help. Thank you for giving me the chance to be useful again, to be loved again, to be part of a real family again." They sat together in comfortable, companionable silence, watching their daughter chase lightning bugs in the golden evening light, while the Sophie and Emma Foundation's latest newsletter sat on the patio table beside them, filled with thank you letters from grateful families whose lives had been changed by unexpected kindness and second chances. Somewhere in heaven, Sophie was probably laughing with delight at the beautiful chaos Emma brought to every situation, proud that her father had learned to love again. Somewhere across the country, other struggling parents were receiving help from a foundation built on love, transformed from loss into hope. And right here in this garden, in this perfect moment, two people who had found each other through divine accident and chosen each other through conscious intention were living proof that second chances were not just possible, but miraculous. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, a photo from a grateful mother whose childcare costs had been covered by the foundation, allowing her to keep her job and maintain stability for her children. The image showed a little boy Emma's age, grinning widely as he played with new toys purchased with the mother's first full paycheck in months. One more family helped, Sarah observed, showing the photo to Marcus. One more family that won't have to choose between pride and their children's basic needs, Marcus agreed, his voice rich with satisfaction and purpose. As the sun set over their perfect, imperfect, beautifully ordinary life, Sarah realized that the very best love stories were never about flawless people finding each other in ideal circumstances. They were about broken people choosing to heal together, about wrong numbers that led to exactly right connections, about finding the courage to believe that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, no matter how far they've fallen or how impossible their dreams might seem. And sometimes, if you were incredibly lucky and brave enough to ask for help when you needed it most, that second chance came disguised as a desperate text message sent to a stranger who was desperately hoping to be useful again, to matter again, to love again. In the end, what had started as Sarah's biggest mistake, sending a plea for help to the wrong number, had become the greatest blessing of both their lives. Proof that the universe sometimes conspires to put exactly the right message in front of exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, creating ripples of love and kindness that extend far beyond what anyone could have imagined.